Madagascar. In long-form Republic of Madagascar, is an island state located in the Indian Ocean and geographically attached to the African continent, from which it is separated by the Mozambique Channel. 1,580 kilometers long and 580 kilometers wide, Madagascar covers an area of 587,000 square kilometers, which ranks it as the fourth largest island in the world, after Greenland, New Guinea, and Borneo. Its capital is Antananarivo 8 and the country's currency is the Ariary. Its inhabitants, the Malagasy, are a people combining a mixture of populations of Austronesian and East African origins, but speaking a Malayo-Polynesian language, Malagasy. The country is surrounded by other islands and archipelagos, the Comoros including Mayotte, the Mascarenes including Réunion and Mauritius, and the Seychelles. During most of the 19th century, the island was administered by the Kingdom of Madagascar. This administration was exercised within the framework of the French Protectorate of Madagascar after 1883, following the first Madagascar expedition. Considering that the protectorate was poorly applied by the Malagasy government, France organized a second military expedition from 1895. The French establishments of Diego Suarez, Nosy and Sainte-Marie Island were attached to the protectorate on January 28, 1896. The troubles following the French military intervention led, in 1897, to the end of Malagasy autonomy, to the annexation of the island by France and to the reunion of the former protectorate and other French territories within the colony of Madagascar and dependencies. The first autonomous Malagasy government was reborn on October 14, 1958, when the Republic of Madagascar was proclaimed on the territory of the former protectorate while remaining a member of the French community. In 1960, the Malagasy Republic gained independence, making the country one of the first to become sovereign in this area of the Indian Ocean. The country is divided into 6 ancient historical provinces, with the same names as Antalya. For 20 centuries, Madagascar has been shaped by peoples from diverse backgrounds to create the current multicultural Malagasy society. This country of more than 26 million inhabitants is very culturally diverse and has 18 distinct ethnic groups or indigenous nations, each speaking a Malagasy dialect, as well as 3 minorities who arrived over the last 3 centuries, the Karens, the Sinoas, and the Vasahas. Madagascar belongs to the group of least developed countries according to the UN. In addition, Madagascar faces insufficient growth and persistent poverty, largely due to weaknesses in governance. History. Archaeological discoveries suggest the first presence of humans in Madagascar at least 10,000 years ago. These are traces of butchery on a giant bird, a species that is now extinct. The origin of the current Malagasy population is diverse and debated. The Malagasy are sometimes considered to be predominantly of Austronesian descent like their languages, and sometimes, given their proximity to Africa, to be predominantly African. Indian, Melanesian, or even Phoenician origins have also been proposed. A large pangenomic study was launched throughout the Malagasy territory. This study showed in 2018 that each Malagasy is the result of ancient crossbreeding between Austronesian-speaking populations and Bantu-speaking populations. The proportions of reserved Y chromosomes of African origin appear to be more common than those of East Asian origin. However, the mtDNA lineages, transmitted from mother to child, have inverse proportions. The arrival of Austronesian populations has given rise to numerous studies. Computer simulations of navigation between Indonesia and Madagascar allow us to understand the possible routes that led to the colonization of Madagascar by Austronesians from the beginning of our era. The Maldives, and to a lesser extent the neighboring Chagos, were a probable stopover on the route to Madagascar, both from Sumatra and from southern India and Sri Lanka, where Javanese and Malay sailors and merchants went for trade. As for the cause of the arrival of these Austronesians, the history of the Indian Ocean at the beginning of the first millennium of our era is still very poorly understood. We can only assume that the island of Madagascar played an important role in trade, particularly that of spices, between Southeast Asia and the Middle East, directly or via the African coasts. It is possible that these Vahoka and Taolo were particularly looking for solid wood to build their canoes, such as the Lakana or the Vintana. The Vazimbas and the Vezos. At the beginning of human settlement, called the Paleo-Malagasy period, the Antaolo seem to have divided into two large groups according to their subsistence choices, the Vazimbas who settled, as their name indicates, in the forests of the interior, and the Vezos who remained on the west coast. The term Vazimba therefore originally referred to the Antaolo hunters and gatherers who decided to settle in the forest, particularly in the forests of the central highlands of the Big Island and those of the east and southeast coast, while the Vizo were the Antaolo fishermen who remained on the west and south coasts. The word Vazimba is an Austronesian qualifier designating forest dwellers in general, including the Austronesians themselves who settled in the forests. It is not excluded that other aboriginal Vazimba hominids, of the Flores man type for example, lived in the forests of Madagascar tens, or even hundreds, of thousands of years before the arrival of the Austronesian Vazimba. Some may still have existed when the Austronesian Vahoka and Taolo arrived in the first millennium BCE. This could explain the myth of the little men, primary dwarves of the forest that the Austronesian Vahoka and Taolo, ancestors of the majority of current Malagasy, would have encountered and assimilated or perhaps annihilated upon their arrival. Only archaeology and genetics could provide evidence to support this myth. It is also possible that the myth of the Vazimba, little men dwarves, was brought by the Austronesians from the islands where they previously inhabited, in which case this myth could indeed concern the hominids of the Flores or Negrito type. The latter, small in size, in fact inhabited the forests of the Sunda Islands well before the arrival of the Austronesians, and are considered to be the aboriginal peoples there. For example, we know that the myth of the ogre Trimobi, child eater, is a tale brought by the Austronesians and actually speaks of the tiger who inhabits the forests of the Sunda Islands. The myth of the little Vazimba dwarves could have undergone a similar journey. Neo-Austronesian, Bantu, Persian and Arab immigrations from the middle of the first millennium until around 1600, the island welcomed Middle Eastern immigrants, Africans and Orientals, and even Europeans, who integrated and acculturated into Vizo and Vazimba society, often through marriage. Cultural, political, and technological contributions will be at the origin of the great upheavals of the 16th century, which will lead to the Malagasy feudal era. The Neo-Austronesian clans, for their part, historically and globally, without distinction of their island of origin, called the Hova, have, according to oral traditions, landed in the north and east of the island. According to the observation of linguists on the subject of borrowings from Old Malay, Old Javanese and Old Budgie of the Middle Ages in the original Proto-Austronesian vocabulary stock, the first Hova waves arrived in the 8th century at the earliest. Diplomats, officers, scholars, traders, or simple soldiers, some allied with the Orang Lot or Talat sailors, these Hova probably came from the Indonesian thalassocracies. Their leaders, known under the name of Diana or Andriana or Reandriana, were, for the most part, allied with the Vazimba clans. To the northwest in the region of present-day Ankoala on the east coast, The August 10, 1500, the Portuguese Diogo Dias was the first European to sight Madagascar, which he called the island São Lourenço. Ancient period, birth of ethnic groups and kingdoms. Austronesian village with levy on stilts. All the villages of the Antaolo, Vazimba and Vizo of Madagascar were probably similar in the first millennium. We still find this model today on all the coasts of the Big Island and in the remote interior areas. Peruvian General Luis Miguel Sanchez Cerro, President of Peru twice between 1930 and 1933, was partly descended from Malagasy slaves brought there in the 16th century. Inland, the struggles for hegemony of the various Neo-Vazimba clans of the Central Highlands, which the other Neo-Vizo clans of the coasts called without distinction the Hovo, led to the birth of the Marina, Bitsilio, Bezinosino, Sihanika, Tsimiheti, and Bara kingdoms and/or ethnic groups. On the coasts, the integration of New Eastern, Middle Eastern and African immigrants gave birth to the Neo-Vizo kingdoms and/or ethnic groups, Anticarana, Boina, Manabe, and Vezos, Mahafali and Antandroy, Antisaka, Antambahoka, Antimoro, Antifasi, Antanala, Batsimisarika. The birth of these great post-Vazimba post-Vizo kingdoms essentially modified the political structure of the old world of the Neo-Vazimba and Neo-Vizo clans, but the great majority of the old categories remained intact within these new kingdoms. The common language, customs, traditions, the sacred, the economy, the art of the ancients remained preserved in their great majority, with variations in form according to the regions. Today, the population of Madagascar can be considered as the product of a mix between the first Austronesian Vahoka and Taolo occupants and those who arrived later. Genetically, the original Austronesian heritage is more or less well distributed throughout the island. Researchers have notably noted the presence, everywhere, of the Polynesian motif, an old characteristic marker of Austronesian populations dating from before the great immigrations to the Polynesian and Melanesian islands. This would suppose a common starting point between the ancestors of the current Polynesians who left for the Pacific Islands to the east and the Vahoka and Taolo who left west to Madagascar around 500 BC. Phenotypically, it is among the highland populations, who are more endogamous, that the Austronesian Mongoloid phenotype is most prevalent. The Austronesian Australoid and Austronesian Negrito phenotype are also sometimes observed throughout Madagascar, including on the highlands. Unlike the Bantu phenotype, the Austronesian Negrito phenotype is characterized in particular by its small size. The local populations also suffered, as in many African countries, from the slave trade. Thus, for example, Malagasy slaves were brought by Europeans to the Viceroyalty of Peru, in South America, and settled mainly on the northern coast of the country, in the Pira region. There is even a place in Peru called Malacasi Farm, which dates from the time when the Malagasy were exploited in the cultivation of the fields, and which evokes the name of their country of origin, just as it is pronounced in their own language. Currently in Peru, the descendants of these slaves are known as Mangaics, a corruption of the language over time. These descendants of the Malagasy have still preserved in many cases, the characteristics of Afro-Indonesian origin. Their integration in Peru has been so strong that they have contributed to the culture of this country by the creation of musical forms such as tondero. They even had an influence in the political field, since the former Peruvian president Luis Miguel Sanchez Cerro, who governed this country in the third decade of the 20th century, was a Mangaic. Colonial era. Jean Laborde was appointed first consul of France in Madagascar on April 12, 1862, under the Second Empire, that is to say before colonization properly speaking. He was the tutor of the future King Radamatu, but also the confidant of the missionaries, the initiator of Malagasy industry and the lover of Queen Ranavalonai. The end of the 19th century, with the division of Africa between the European colonial empires at the Berlin Conference, sounded the death knell for the expansion and independence of the Kingdom of Madagascar. Until then, Malagasy politicians had played on the rivalries of the colonial powers to maintain their sovereignty. The Berlin Conference left France as the favorite to appropriate the island. France then signed a treaty with the Kingdom of Madagascar based on the ambiguity of the Malagasy language and which theoretically gave no rights to the French Republic over the Kingdom of Madagascar. But, as diplomatic incidents arose, France pursued an increasingly intrusive policy, then undertook the conquest of the island. French conquest. The resistance was massive. The Malagasy army managed to repel the first waves of invasion in 1883, but the decisive battles would follow. They are known as the Second Franco-Malagasy War. When the French government sent an army of poorly prepared conscripts that advanced very slowly, diseases ravaged their ranks. Finally, at the first cannon shot on the capital Antananarivo, Queen Ranavalona III had the white flag raised. Contrary to a story forged by the authorities, then disseminated in education, the Malagasy were easily defeated. The main enemies were neither the native monarchs or chiefs, nor the slave-trading sultans, but the climate and diseases. When the Madagascar campaign ended in 1895, the French army recorded 13 killed and 88 wounded during the fighting, and 4,498 deaths from disease, representing nearly 30% of losses out of a total force of 14,850 men. French administration. The conquest was followed by 10 years of latent civil war, due to the Minalamba insurrection. The insurrection originated among the Sokolaves people and quickly spread to the capital Tananarive and elsewhere. This insurrection was in opposition to French colonization and the Merina political class converted to Protestantism. The rebels did not aim to restore the Queen and were opposed to Christianity and the system of forced labor that existed in the Merina kingdom. The rebels were largely made up of peasants and runaway slaves. 65. The pacification led by the French administration lasted more than 15 years, in response to the rural guerrillas scattered throughout the country. In total, this civil war and the repression of this resistance to colonial conquest caused between 50,000 and 700,000 Malagasy victims, depending on the sources. Madagascar will be under French administration from August 6, 1896 to October 14, 1958. General Joseph Gallieni, appointed Governor-General of Madagascar, helped to pacify the island, not without repressive measures. According to the latter, military action had to be accompanied by aid to the colonized peoples in different areas, such as administration, economy, and education. It required permanent contact with the inhabitants as well as a perfect knowledge of the country and its languages. September 27, 1896, the French administration abolished slavery. Trintignant, Joffre, and Lyotta served in Madagascar under the orders of Gallieni. During the summer of 1897, the Ambiki massacre took place, cited by Aimé Césaire in his discourse on colonialism, as one of the examples of the violence of colonial conquest. Under Gallieni's leadership, many infrastructures were put in place: the first Tonanaive-Tamatave Railway, completion of the Madagascar Railway, rapid development of the road network, Pasteur Institute, schools. All schools established before the colonial era were closed and the obligation for natives to speak French was introduced. In 1907, for the first time in a century, Malagasy exports were greater than imports. Planters and the colonial administration grew rich, and huge mining and forestry concessions were granted to large companies. Indigenous chiefs loyal to the French administration were also granted part of the land, and some young Malagasy went to study in France, helping to make Madagascar known. Forced labor was introduced in favor of French companies, and peasants were encouraged, through taxes, to work for wages, especially in colonial concessions, to the detriment of small individual farms. With 46,000 men, Madagascar was one of the French colonies to mobilize the most soldiers in relation to its population during the First World War. The colonial period was, however, accompanied by movements fighting for independence, the Minalamba, the Vy Vato Saklika, the democratic movement for Malagasy renovation. In 1927, major demonstrations were organized in Antananarivo, notably at the initiative of the communist activist François Vittori, imprisoned following this action. The 1930s saw the Malagasy anti-colonial movement gain even more dynamism. Malagasy trade unionism began to appear underground and the Communist Party of the Madagascar region was formed. But by 1939, all the organizations were dissolved by the colonial administration, which opted for the Vichy regime. The MDRM was accused by the colonial regime of being at the origin of the 1947 insurrection and was pursued by violent repression. The repression carried out against the Malagasy resistance to colonization is said to have caused more than 100,000 deaths between 1897 and 1947 for a population of 3 million inhabitants at the time. Second World War. During World War II, one Nazi project remained on the drawing board, the Madagascar Plan aimed at deporting 4 million Jews from Germany, its allied countries and its conquered territories, to Madagascar, then a French colony of the Vichy regime. From May 1942, fearing that the government of Philippe Pétain would open the Malagasy ports to German submarines or the Imperial Japanese Navy, the British Empire conducted Operation Ironclad and gradually took possession of strategic points on the island. When the Free French arrived in January 1943, control of these points became the subject of tensions between General de Gaulle and the British government. The return of Malagasy fighters enlisted during the Second World War, the discrimination of the indigenous regime and the miserable living conditions of the natives encouraged the militancy of anti-colonialist movements aspiring to independence and created the conditions for an insurrection. The Malagasy uprising began in March 1947, leading to a bloody repression by the French army, which left several tens of thousands dead, the figures varying, depending on the source, between 10,000 and 89,000 according to Jacques Tronchin. The repression was accompanied by summary executions, torture, forced regroupings and the burning of villages. The French army experimented with psychological warfare, suspects were thrown, alive, from planes in order to terrorize the villagers in the regions of operation. An overseas territory from 1946 to 1958, Madagascar obtained a first level of autonomy on October 10, 1958, as the autonomous Malagasy Republic within the community. On October 14, Philibert Tsarayana became president of the Government Council before being elected the first president of the Republic on May 1, 1959. Independence and First Republic. The island gained independence on June 26, 1960, but the First Malagasy Republic remained very closely linked to France through cooperation agreements. President Tsarayana, criticized by the population for his support of French interests, faced growing protest, in particular the student strike led from the capital to the provinces, and left power in 1972. He gave full powers to General Gabriel Ramanantsoa, who decided to organize a referendum to formalize his power for a transitional period. The referendum having approved him, he created a government of national unity, which he led until 1975, before passing the torch to the popular gendarmerie Colonel Richard Ratsamandrova. The latter was assassinated after a week, on February 11, 1975 at 8 p.m. After the assassination of General Ratsamandrova, Madagascar was led by a national military leadership committee chaired by General Andrea Mahazo. On June 14, 1975, Didier Ratsirika was appointed head of state and government. The National Military Leadership Committee was then replaced by a National Revolutionary Committee. Socialist State and Second Republic. The Second Malagasy Republic is related to a communist state, even if private property is not abolished there, and religion is not persecuted. Like the Cuban regime, it controls all trade with the outside world, sets up a single party in March 1976, the vanguard of the Malagasy Revolution, and relies on the Eastern Bloc to survive. To begin, on December 21, 1975, frigate Captain Didier Ratsirika organizes a referendum to approve the Charter of the Socialist Revolution and the new constitution. On December 30, 1975, Didier Ratsirika proclaims the Malagasy Democratic Republic. Subsequently, he becomes one of the active activists of non-alignment. In 1976, the government completes the expulsion of the French army and closes the embassies and consulates. Ratsirika introduced the Malagasy franc and abandoned the CFA franc. 10 years later, towards the end of the 1980s, there was talk of the failure of the socialist experiment because Didier Ratsirika's regime failed to improve living conditions and opposition grew. In the early 1990s, the end of support from the Eastern Bloc forced the regime to allow private investors to operate in the country. Food shortages provoked popular demonstrations that were repressed by the army at the cost of many victims. Albert Zafai presidency. The Convention of October 31, 1991 was adopted to end the riots in the country. It formalized a democratic and liberal transition led by Albert Zafai, who headed the high authority of the state, while Didier Ratsirika symbolically remained president of the republic. After a brief transitional period, a new constitution was adopted by referendum and Albert Zafai, an opposition candidate, was elected president in 1993. This was the beginning of an unprecedented economic and political liberalism, but the promised and long-awaited growth was not forthcoming either. The president appealed to the September 17, 1995 to a constitutional referendum in order to give the President of the Republic the power to appoint the Prime Minister and thus dismiss Francis Scrivoni, supported by the majority deputies. This is the beginning of an open war between the President and the deputies, which will end with the vote in June 1996, the impeachment of the President. Prime Minister Norbert Ratsirahonana becomes interim head of state pending new elections. Marc Ravalomanana presidency. The mayor of the capital, Marc Ravalomanana, comes out on top in the presidential election of December 2001. A second round is planned, but he claims victory in the first round based on the results published by his own headquarters in Ankarandrano. Ravalomanana denounces massive electoral fraud and decides to corner the Ratsirika government. President Didier Ratsirika tries to regain control by changing the members of the High Constitutional Court, responsible for proclaiming the electoral results in Madagascar. Candidate Ravalomanana demands the confrontation of the minutes in his possession and the official minutes. The government refuses such a method, which it considers illegal, but urges opponents to participate in the second round. Marc Ravalomanana was elected president of the republic and later appointed Jacques Silla as prime minister. With the capital having won over to the cause of the former mayor, Didier Ratsirika decided to relocate the seat of government to Tomasina, his stronghold and the island's main port located in the east. The government erected roadblocks to paralyze and asphyxiate the capital, which ended up paralyzing the entire country. At the invitation of the African Union and Senegalese President Abdoulaye Wade, the two protagonists met in Dakar and signed agreements in April 2002 which included a new vote count, the organization of a referendum instead of a second round if an absolute majority was not obtained, and the establishment of a government of national unity led by Mr. Ravalomanana. These agreements were not respected by the two parties, who stuck to their positions once they returned to the country. Ravalomanana did not ease the pressure and ended up obtaining the annulment of the appointment of the new High Constitutional Court due to a procedural defect, The previous court, reappointed in its functions, was responsible for publishing the election results. In May 2002, Mark Ravalomanana was declared the winner in the first round with more than 51% of the vote. He was sworn in as president of the Republic a week later. He confirmed Jacques Silla as prime minister. He decided to call on army reservists to launch expeditions against troops loyal to Didier Ratsirika and to liberate the provinces from the roadblocks. The two camps now clash militarily. In July 2002, Tomasina, the last province where the Ratsirika camp had entrenched itself, fell into the hands of Ravalomanana. Didier Ratsirika fled with his followers on a plane to France. Western countries, led by the United States and lastly France, recognized Ravalomanana's victory. However, the African Union, the UN, and donors only recognized Mark Ravalomanana's government in January 2003, following the legislative elections won by his party. At the end of his first term, President Mark Ravalomanana developed his Vision Madagascar naturally and implemented the Madagascar Action Plan, a new 5-year development program. In December 2006, President Mark Ravalomanana was re-elected in the first round with 56% of the vote for a second 5-year term, with the main objective of implementing MAP. In April 2007, Mark Ravalomanana had the constitution amended by referendum in a way that strengthened presidential powers by allowing ordinances in cases of emergency and disaster. This revision also introduced English as a third official language, modified the administrative structure by replacing the 6 autonomous provinces with 22 regions and removed the secular character of the Malagasy state. The opposition sees in this revision risks of autocratic drift, while the Malagasy Catholic Church severely criticizes the organization of the referendum, and points out the exorbitant power granted to the president. The Catholic Episcopal authorities fear that President Ravalomanana, who is vice president of the powerful Reformed Church of Madagascar, will interfere directly in religious activities. Over the years, opposition parties have accused the government of paralyzing local businesses such as Savaneri Tropical, and the Quartz Company. The government is not neutral with regard to the various competitions between businesses, which should only rely on themselves to ensure their management. Mark Ravalomanana is also singled out by the opposition for having eliminated successful Malagasy entrepreneurs, monopolized their businesses to place himself in all the profitable economic sectors. The main problem is that incessant internal struggles combined with the age of the majority of the elites neglecting their succession have created a political vacuum and brought about a cruel lack of emulation. The electoral process is also strongly criticized by opponents, who would like to make significant improvements to it in order to avoid unrest during each presidential election. In August 2008, the Ravalomanana government engaged in an intense standoff with the urban commune of Antananarivo, led by the rebellious mayor of the capital, Andry Rajoelina. Since the latter's accession to this position, there has been the confiscation of the commune's revenues by the treasury, the withdrawal from the commune of management of the Ampasapito bus station, the withdrawal of management of the capital's sanitation. On the other hand, there has been a lack of serious work on the part of the town hall and the flagrant degradation of the city. In July 2008, the Malagasy president grants a license to exploit 1.3 million hectares of land, half of Madagascar's arable land, for a period of 99 years to the South Korean multinational Daewoo Logistics with the aim of supplying South Korea, particularly with corn. The information was revealed in November following its publication in the Financial Times, relayed by other media around the world, and sowed panic among the people in the capital, as well as anger and fear of the invader, helping to bring Andry Rajoelina to power, who denounced the agreement as unconstitutional in March 2009. In December 2008, Mark Ravalomanana's Minister of Communication closed the Viva television channel of the mayor of Tananarive, Andry Rajoelina, who had broadcast a report on former President Ratsirika. Protests and demonstrations followed. Following the closure of the Viva television channel of the opponent Andry Rajoelina, violent demonstrations and riots shake the capital. February 7, during the storming of the Ambohit Sarahitra State Palace by the crowd, the Presidential Guard opened fire, killing 28 demonstrators and injuring 212 others. The March 16, 2009, mutinous soldiers supporting Andry Rajoelina managed to take the palace by force. Marc Ravalomanana was forced to resign from his post as President of the Republic, to transfer power to a military council, and had to flee to South Africa. These changes were considered by the entire international community as a putsch that France was the first to condemn. A period of political and military arm wrestling followed between the contenders, supported by the armies, regular for one, mutinous for the other. Marc Ravalomanana, Andry Rajoelina, Didier Ratsirika, and Albert Zafai finally meet in August 2009, in the presence of representatives of the African Union, the United Nations, the International Organization of La Francophonie and the Southern African Development Community, for talks that led to the Maputo Accords, the name of the capital of Mozambique. The December 18, 2009, Andry Rajoelina denounces these Maputo agreements, changes prime minister and decides to precede the upcoming legislative elections with a referendum on a new constitution. The referendum finally takes place in November 2010. Fourth Republic. By referendum of November 17, 2010 by direct universal suffrage, the population positions itself yes or no on the change of the constitution. This new constitution is proclaimed on December 11 of the same year, and brought the country into its fourth republic. The semi-presidential regime of the Constitution of the Third Republic revised in 2007 is replaced by a semi-parliamentary regime, according to the 2010 Constitution, Art. 54, the President of the Republic appoints the Prime Minister, presented by the party or group of parties in the majority in the National Assembly. In December 2013, the presidential election and the legislative election were jointly organized in Madagascar. Hiri Rajayanariamampianina was elected first president of the Fourth Republic, eliminating his opponent Jean-Louis Robinson in the second round. He was invested and sworn in at Mahamasina on January 25, 2014. Jean Omer Birizaki is still the head of government until April 16, 2014, or it is replaced by the Roger Kolo government. New change on January 17, 2015, where Jean Ravalomanana becomes head of government. Olivier Mahafali Solanandrasana replaces him April 10, 2016, but to calm the country in the grip of riots, he was forced to resign and replaced by Christian Ansay on June 4, 2018. The elections of December 2018 bring Andry Rajoelina to power for 5 years. He also wins the legislative elections of May 2019 and obtains an absolute majority in the National Assembly. On October 12, 2023, Malagasy President Andry Rajoelina was impeached by Parliament following a motion of censure tabled by the opposition and adopted by 151 votes to 105. The President of the National Assembly, Christine Razanamahaso, was inaugurated as interim president. Politics and administration. Madagascar is a semi-presidential republic with a multi-party system, with the president as head of state and the prime minister as head of government. Executive power is vested in the government, while legislative power is shared between the government and the two houses of parliament, the National Assembly and the Senate. The judiciary is independent of the former two. The current head of state is Andry Rajoelina. elected by direct universal suffrage on December 19, 2018, for a 5-year term, renewable once. He became the second elected president of the Republic of Madagascar and succeeded interim Prime Minister Christian Ansay, who was reappointed to his position by the new president. The transfer of power took place on January 19, 2019. 6 provinces were created in 1959, at the time of the country's independence, and named after their capital. They were split into 22 regions in 2004 and then into 23 regions in 2021. The 2007 revision of the 1992 Constitution removed the autonomy of these provinces. Article 143 of the 2010 Constitution states that the decentralized territorial communities of the Republic are the municipalities, regions, and provinces. Ethnicity. The Malagasy population is mainly of Austronesian and Melanesian origin. The various successive waves of populations coming from all around the Indian Ocean were then grafted onto this common fund and, in each region, the marriage of the new arrivals with the first Austronesian inhabitants resulted in the current diversity. Despite the phenotypically visible differences, genetics shows that the Austronesian fund is commonly shared to varying degrees depending on the region, and it is also culturally very significant. While it is true that there are 18 ethnic groups in Madagascar, the diversity is not of an ethnic nature but rather of a geographical, political, or economic nature. The amalgamation of peoples from the Orient, Southeast Asia, Africa and Arabia is found in each group, from north to south. All clans have a common original culture. Another point of view is to be affirmed, because, on the other hand, there is an enormous difference in Madagascar between the ethnic groups and not the tribes essentially represented by the Merina group and the so-called coastal ethnic groups. If, as in any society, ethnic diversity exists and develops within the framework of the concept of Fahavanana and through Western influences and the development of global trade by Malagasy youth, there persists a kind of latent racism, imperceptible to the Vahini, stemming from the great history and foundations of Malagasy civilization, and in particular from the wars of conquest between the Merina kings and queens from the Malagasy highlands and mainly the Sokolava of the west coast of Madagascar. This racism also exists towards the Merinas and on the part of the subjects of certain Sokolaves kingdoms. Cultural differences are marked between the coastal peoples and those of the highlands, even if ancestor worship is widespread everywhere and the hope of a better life after death generally makes the Malagasy people quite fatalistic in the face of the vagaries of earthly life. Languages. Malagasy is the national language of Madagascar, but each region also has its own mother tongue. French is the second official language, spoken by about 26% of the population, or 8 million people out of 29 million inhabitants in 2022. According to statistics from the Malagasy Academy, in all of Madagascar in 2012, 0.5% of the Malagasy people spoke only French, 16% spoke it occasionally, and 84% only understood Malagasy. English was also an official language from 2007 to 2010. However, the new Constitution of November 2010 only mentions Malagasy and French as official languages, with English having disappeared from the text. Despite the diversity of the population which is at the origin of the different dialects throughout the island, a common language has been formed, Malagasy. This has become today when the official language of the country. It is the dialect of Imerina which was chosen as the official language because of a long tradition of writing dating back to the first half of the 19th century. Linguistically, Malagasy is related to the Austronesian family. Malagasy therefore belongs to the Malayo-Polynesian group of the Western type. The first linguistic tools were created in 1828, but the first text was distributed in 1835. and the publication of the Malagasy Bible quickly imposed the model of a written language and a noble style. Malagasy manuscripts from the 19th century are relatively numerous, but many of them were destroyed at the time of the French colonial conquest. At the end of the Merina monarchy, there were about 10 periodicals published in Antananarivo. Then the colonization of 1896 led to the suppression of the Malagasy press. However, the newspapers of the time had gotten into the habit of publishing poems and literary texts in prose in Malagasy. Today, the Malagasy press and literature seem very much alive. However, the Malagasy publishing market remains extremely limited due to the high cost of book manufacturing. Religion. Main articles: Religion in Madagascar, Christianity in Madagascar, Catholic Church in Madagascar, and Islam in Madagascar. Local religious groups report that 70% of the population is Christian, and are divided as follows: Roman Catholics, Presbyterian Church of Jesus Christ in Madagascar, Lutherans and Anglicans in 2022. In addition to ancestor worship, other Eastern religions are also present on the island. Islam was first brought to the island in the Middle Ages by Arabs and Somali Muslim traders who established several Islamic schools along the eastern coast. Although Islamic astrology spread across the island, the Islamic religion initially failed to take root except in a handful of coastal localities in the southeast before expanding throughout the island in recent years. Today, Muslims represent a minority of the Malagasy population and are largely concentrated in the northwestern provinces of Mahajanga and Ansarayana. Muslims are divided into Malagasy, Indo-Pakistani, and Comorayan ethnic groups. More recently, Hinduism was introduced to Madagascar through people who immigrated from the Kathiawar region of India in the late 19th century. Most Indians in Madagascar speak Gujarati or Hindi. Economy. The creation of the euro favors the strength of the Malagasy currency, which remains independent of the currency of the former colonial metropolis, in the face of the monopoly of the previously strong reference American dollar. In May 2003, the Ariary replaces the Malagasy franc as the currency in Madagascar. From this date, double labeling is applied in shops and markets until the official changeover, the January 1, 2005. Since that date, only the Ariary has been official currency in the country. Corruption is high in the country's administrations. The Center for Research and Publications on Relations between the Third World and Europe denounces the plundering of Madagascar's natural resources, particularly by mining concessions and traffickers of precious wood. Free zones are also sources of immense profits for companies, at the expense of employees, who are often deprived of any rights. For decades, Madagascar has faced insufficient growth and persistent poverty, largely due to weak governance, inadequate human and physical capital development, and slow structural transformation. The situation is exacerbated by increasing climate crises and increased vulnerability to external shocks. In addition, low economic growth combined with rapid population growth has made Madagascar one of the countries with the highest poverty rate in the world, reaching 75% in 2022 based on the national poverty line. Although economic growth slowed from 6% in 2021 to 4% in 2022, largely due to spillovers from the war in Ukraine and climate shocks, it has gradually recovered. Growth is projected to continue its recovery and stabilize at 4% in 2023, before accelerating to around 5% in 2025. Inflationary pressures have intensified, with headline inflation rising from 7% in June 2022 to 11% in June 2023. Inflation is projected to remain at 10.5% in 2023, before moderating to around 8.5% in 2024 to 25. The current account deficit widened from 5% of GDP in 2021 to 5.6% in 2022. However, lower global oil prices are expected to contribute to a further reduction in the current account deficit to 4.5% of GDP in 2023 to 25, as the decline in imports outweighs the slowdown in exports. The rebound in exports could face challenges, however, as restrictive import policies, such as lowering the levels of nicotine allowed in imported food products, by Madagascar's main trading partners in the vanilla sector are likely to hamper progress. The overall fiscal deficit widened from 3% of GDP in 2021 to 6.4% in 2022, and total public debt increased to 57% of GDP in 2022. This deterioration in the fiscal balance largely resulted from the deferral of oil duty payments by oil distributors. The settlement of these cross-debts is expected to reduce the fiscal deficit to 3.8% of GDP in 2023, with tax revenue increasing from 9.6% of GDP in 2022 to 12.8% in 2023. In addition, the planned gradual increase in capital expenditure from 5% of GDP in 2021 to 9% in 2025 reflects improved budget execution and the implementation of the government's priority projects. Customs. An old Austronesian tradition that is still found on certain islands of Indonesia, the Repoblikan'i is a ritual of exhumation of the dead specific especially to the peoples of the highlands, notably the Marinas, and which is becoming rarer due to Christianization. When the diviner gives the signal, the family clan decides to begin the ceremony called the Repoblikan'i. Exhumed a few years after the death, the deceased is first carried in procession with a procession of musicians, then the bones, after a ritual washing, are wrapped in lambas traditionally made of natural silk. The festival marks the definitive return of the ancestors among their descendants, of whom they will become the protectors. It is indeed a festival, jubilation is the rule, tears and lamentations are forbidden. The traditional meal at this festival is very manaka, rice with fatty meat with lots of fat, sometimes pork is added to the zebu meat. The organizing family may even prepare special outfits to mark the festival. This custom is specific to certain tribes in Madagascar and is also an opportunity to bring together the extended family and an opportunity to see who are the people who preserve their relationship with this extended family, having responded to the invitation and made a contribution, usually financial.